Good morning. Good to have you with us on this Thursday. I'm Joe Fryer. Savannah is on assignment. We begin in Washington. President Trump is back at the White House after his brief trip to Europe. At the NATO summit, Mr. Trump continued to insist that Iran's nuclear program was dealt a serious blow by the U.S. A briefing is set to take place at the Pentagon this morning. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth plans to discuss last weekend's U.S. strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities in the country. Now, an initial assessment by the Defense Intelligence Agency concluded the strikes were not as effective as the president originally claimed they were, an assessment the White House has aggressively rejected. Looking forward, President Trump announced at the NATO summit that the U.S. is planning to meet next week with Iran. At issue, how to move forward following those airstrikes.
We may sign an agreement. I don't know. To me, I don't think it's that necessary. I mean, they had a war, they fought, now they're going back to their world. I don't care if I have an agreement or not. The only thing we'd be asking for is what we were asking for before about we want no nuclear, but we destroyed the nuclear.
Amid all this, that ceasefire that President Trump announced earlier this week between Iran and Israel, well, it does still seem to be holding. We have plenty of coverage ahead this hour, including the latest on the ground in the Middle East and on Capitol Hill. Let's begin with NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba. She's in Washington. Monica, good morning. So President Trump has doubled down on his claim that U.S. strikes resulted in the obliteration of Iranian nuclear sites. How is the administration making its case? I mean, what kind of new information might we expect to hear from the defense secretary in just a bit?
Well, that's right, Joe. He has doubled down, tripled down, quadrupled down on this. And the president is really going to some extraordinary lengths to try to defend this narrative. And a lot of this is about optics. It is about messaging in some way, because this is about an intelligence report that is initial, that is preliminary, and that really cannot give a full picture yet of the extent of the damage at those nuclear sites in Iran. But the president took great offense to the idea that some of this intelligence got out at an early stage, and so he's trying to cite some of these other initial assessments from different countries, like Iran's own and Israel's own Atomic Energy Commission, that essentially said that the program would be set back by years as a result of these strikes and not months, which is what the original Defense Intelligence Agency report said. But this is all about now the president, again, trying to put forth a rebuttal to this, and he's going to do that with the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, who's going to have a pretty, I imagine, combative press conference this morning. But the bottom line, and to remind everybody, is that we may not know for a very long time the actual extent of this damage. And then that sets aside questions, too, about the enriched uranium that may or may not have been moved. The White House maintains that it was destroyed in these strikes, but outside experts have questions about whether it was moved and whether it's still in the country. And, of course, that will be key to determine. And, again, we may not know that for some time either.
Yeah, could take definitely some time to learn that. Just a few moments ago, we played those comments from President Trump where, ahead of a potential meeting with Iranian officials, he talked about not caring if there's an actual agreement between the nations. So what should we read into that? Does the White House feel like the Iranian nuclear program is no longer a threat?
And that was a real headline out of this press conference yesterday, because we know there have been some indirect and sometimes direct communication with Iranian officials. Obviously, there were those months of trying to have talks to get to a diplomatic solution before U.S. intervention with the strikes. But when the president said that we, as in the U.S., would be talking to Iranian officials next week, a lot of people were not quite sure exactly what he was talking about, whether there's actually going to be some kind of a meeting. We knew that there was a potential last-minute effort explored before the strikes, where there could have been talks with Vice President Vance or Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and some Iranian officials in Turkey. That was going to be a back channel that was going to be established. Is that something that perhaps they're exploring again? Unclear. Or is this a situation, to your point, where they're going to try to draft some language? The president implied that Secretary Rubio perhaps could go and try to get that secured, but it was unclear exactly how, when, and where that would take place.
Monica, while I have you, I do want to ask you about the president's day ahead. He's expected to hold an event at the White House this afternoon about his so-called big, beautiful bill. There are growing doubts on both sides of the aisle about some of the items in it, yet he says he still wants to get this done by the 4th of July. Just where do things stand right now?
Yeah, that is absolutely the position of the White House, even though that seems like it's going to be pretty difficult and there are still plenty of legislative hurdles that it needs to clear. But the president today is going to have a major show of what he says can be accomplished if this mega bill does pass. And he wants to try to showcase that with some people who would benefit from this domestic legislation that spans everything from the economy to border security and other programs. But there are still a lot of controversy about what it could mean for Medicaid cuts. Again, the president and his top aides have said that really failure is not an option here. When you look at what he's been able to do legislatively, there haven't been victories like this would be if this were to pass. And so the president is putting a lot of pressure on lawmakers, and he effectively told them, get into a room, huddle together, and get this done in the next week or so. But that still could face a lot of challenges.
Yeah,
Joe.
we're going to talk more about the bill and its potential impacts with Julie Sirkin in just a moment. Monica Alba, thank you so much. Let's go overseas and bring in NBC News international correspondent Matt Bradley. He's in Tel Aviv. Matt, good morning. Let's start with President Trump's continued claims the U.S. strikes obliterated Iran's nuclear program, despite that initial U.S. Defense Intelligence assessment that the program was only set back by 3 to 6 months. Monica just touched on this, but what are Israeli and Iranian leaders saying about the extent of the damage?
Well, it's interesting because it looks as though Iranian leaders are actually saying that this was destroyed. We just heard actually from the Ayatollah Khamenei. He spoke for the first time just now, ever since this Israeli offensive started, and he, struck a defiant posture, as you would expect. He says that he's declared victory over the Israelis. But, as far as the Israelis are concerned, the job is done. The Fordo plant is destroyed. We heard that from multiple people within Israeli officialdom, and it sounds as though the Iranians more or less agree.
So, Matt, it has been now roughly 48 hours since that ceasefire between Israel and Iran took effect. You're there in Israel. Tell us, how have things shifted where you are in that time? What is the general feeling on the ground?
Yeah, I would say that most people here are very relieved, and it really feels as though this is going to hold. And that's something that I think a lot of Israelis are betting on. From my conversations with people who are close to the prime minister's office, they say that there's an enormous amount of optimism there, that there is this feeling that this is it. Whether the Israelis got what they wanted in the end, that's another question entirely. It did seem as though they were willing to make some concessions, at least for now, on their main goal of totally destroying Iran's uranium enrichment program. Now, again, as we've been discussing, there's differing claims on whether or not that was actually accomplished. But remember that in all of Israel's theaters of war over the past year and a half, even when they signed some sort of truce, some sort of ceasefire, they continue to fire at their enemies even after that's been done. We've seen that in Gaza and in Lebanon. This is something that will likely repeat itself. So the Israelis can be comfortable that they still maintain, even with this truce, military dominance over Iran.
Matt, I want to ask you about what's happening in Iran. There are growing fears the regime there is using its conflict with Israel to crack down on its own population. 3 people were executed, hundreds more arrested on accusations of spying yesterday. What more can you tell us about this?
Yeah, that's right. And different NGOs have different numbers, some as low as in the 200s of people who were arrested, some as many as in the 500s who've been arrested ever since this started. And we know that the Iranians also cut off internet. They said, in part, not to compromise people's positions, but it sounded like it was also a repressive tool. But one thing that we're seeing with all of these arrests, and also there were 3 people who were executed over just the past couple of days ever since this tit-for-tat attacks between Iran and Israel started. This crackdown also has the effect of showing the population of Iran that the state is still intact, that the regime is still able to police its people and do so harshly. So that might be one of the intentions of this crackdown, not just to look for supposed Israeli spies, though that certainly is something that the Israelis even boasted about, that they had Mossad agents in Iran in the lead up to this operation. So the Iranian fears aren't unfounded, but they also want to be able to exert power and show the public that they will not tolerate dissent, even as they're so weakened right now.
All right. Matt Bradley in Tel Aviv. Matt, thank you so much. Staying on this subject, let's bring in NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Julie Sirkin. So, Julie, we understand the Senate is expected to vote today on a resolution that's aimed at reasserting Congress's role in authorizing military action abroad. That, of course, is in response to President Trump greenlighting those recent strikes on Iran without consulting the House or the Senate. Democrats really felt in the dark about this. Tell us a little more about the resolution itself and what are the odds it could actually pass?
Well, the odds aren't great, and that is because, Joe, as you know, Republicans control the Senate and the House, and so far most of the party has lined up behind the president. Even when they saw, some of them, that assessment that you heard Monica talking about, they still think that what the president did was right. The top leadership in the Congress and the Senate said that they do not think that the president needed to gain approval from Congress. They did officially notify Congress, though with very little detail. So that's where this war powers resolution comes in. Senator Tim Kaine actually introduced it before U.S. Launched those strikes against Iranian nuclear sites because he didn't think the administration would seek approval from Congress, and I guess he was right. Now, the thing is, only Rand Paul, we expect, to potentially sign on to this bill. That means it'll fall far short of the simple majority, 51 votes needed to pass. Either way, though, it is nothing more than a messaging tool. The administration is within their right, technically, to launch those strikes, only seeking approval or notifying Congress afterwards. It's if they put boots on the ground or escalate this any further that Congress is going to want a bigger say in this. And by the way, they also have those briefings that you talked about, long awaited, certainly by Democrats especially.
Julie, I also want to ask you what we mentioned earlier. We're going to talk to you about the president's tax and spending bill. One of the biggest sticking points in that is cuts to Medicaid. I know you've been looking at how that could affect rural hospitals, including in red states. Tell us what you found.
Well, for months we've been hearing about Medicaid, right? From Democrats and Republicans, we've seen people come to the Hill to try and protest against these cuts. But I wondered what the impact really is like, especially to those rural communities. So I traveled to Missouri last week. I spoke to a patient, a provider, and a hospital administrator, and they spoke of some devastating impacts that these cuts could lead to. Watch.
In this small town in rural Missouri, past miles of farmland, is where Sierra Matthews lives with her 2 young sons.
Gotta pace yourself better.
Before Missouri voted to expand Medicaid access in 2020, Sierra, who works in the public school system, had no health insurance, and she falls below the poverty line.
Medicaid kind of gave you almost like another chance at life.
Oh my God, yeah. I 100% have been a completely different person just from the diagnosis alone.
Sierra finally received the mental health treatment she says she desperately needed.
What do you think it would mean for her to lose access to that medication?
She just wouldn't be doing as good. I love her.
Republican lawmakers proposed changes to Medicaid as they attempt to cut federal spending and fund President Trump's agenda.
We're making some common sense reforms to Medicaid to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse.
On the table, new work requirements for some adults and limiting a healthcare provider fee that states use to fund Medicaid, especially in rural areas.
I'm concerned about some of what the House has done on rural hospitals, essentially the hospital tax.
Dr. Rothermick is the chief of staff at the hospital in the town of Herman where Sierra lives. He says the proposal means billions in funding would be gone.
To suddenly change it without identifying a way to pick up those lost funds is going to leave a lot of patients, providers, facilities without appropriate funding to take care of the patients that need our care.
Is there any more fat to trim here?
I don't think there is.
Rothermick says they are already underwater. Just 3 doctors work at the hospital that cares for patients in 2 counties, where about 1 in 4 people rely on Medicaid. Those 3 doctors have to work overtime and in some cases multiple jobs to fill the void.
You wear many hats.
I do. I work with the health departments. I work with the EMS as their medical directors. And I even have a role in hospice that I work outside of this.
The resources are even fewer in southern Missouri.
We've lost 3 hospitals in the last 10 years in our region.
Karen White is the administrator for the only healthcare provider in a 3 to 4 hour radius. And Karen says nearly half the population her hospital services relies on Medicaid.
I think we will see loss of life. Maybe not immediate, but if chronic conditions go untreated for an extended period of time, it does result in lower quality of life, less people working.
President Trump says he wants to preserve Medicaid.
The Democrats are going to destroy Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And we're going to keep them but even make them stronger.
Missouri, like many other states which will be affected by this policy change, overwhelmingly elected Trump.
It does seem a little odd that the folks that elected them will be the ones that are impacted the most with these cuts.
Do you regret your vote?
In some of the decisions that have been made, yes.
Now, Joe, you could clearly see how devastating this could be for millions of Americans. 72 million Americans are actually insured through Medicaid, but it could also have political consequences for Republicans. And that is exactly what some Republican senators have warned one another about in a closed-door meeting this week. That's why they're trying to come up with last-minute solutions for this, including a fund that would go directly to rural hospitals. The problem is they still have so much to work out and so little time as Trump dials up the pressure on Republicans to pass his one big, beautiful bill. Joe?
And stories like yours are the ones that could impact what ultimately happens. Sorry, Julie Sirkin, thank you so much. An investigation is underway this morning after some scary moments in the sky. An American Airlines flight was forced to turn around just minutes after takeoff in Las Vegas yesterday. Video shows sparks and smoke coming from one of the plane's engines as it was returning to the runway. NBC News correspondent Steve Patterson explains what happened.
A terrifying moment after takeoff.
American 6065, same time, it looks like it's flames coming out of the engine. Yeah, we're going to have to return.
Video showing flames flickering from the plane's right side, accompanied by what appears to be a constant knocking from the engine. The American Airlines flight spewing a smoke trail across the skies over Sin City, spotted from the ground after a witness says they heard an audible boom. The Charlotte-bound flight from Las Vegas took off with 153 passengers and 6 crew members. Within minutes, the plane was forced to turn around, landing back safely on the ground in Vegas. Authorities say no one was injured. American Airlines calling the incident a mechanical issue, adding the aircraft taxied to the gate under its own power and customers deplaned normally, adding there was no evidence of fire in the engine.
It appears to be what is known as a compressor stall. When this happens, it scares everybody on the airplane, but the pilots will pull the power levers back and reduce the thrust being put out by the engine, and that typically will settle the engine down.
The FAA says they will investigate, and the plane has been taken out of service. A short scare for those on board, now thankful to be back on solid ground. Steve Patterson, NBC News.
The sweltering heat that's gripping much of the country is kind of like a game of weather whack-a-mole. The heat wave is starting to end for some, but it's showing no signs of letting up in other places. Temperatures from the mid-Atlantic to the Ohio Valley expected to climb into the 90s today. Many Americans are still recovering from a scorching Wednesday that saw states from South Carolina to Connecticut set new record highs. NBC News correspondent Shaquille Brewster joins us now from Chicago with more on the weather. Shaq, good morning. So, where you are in Chicago, what can folks expect there today?
Well, it's funny, you mentioned that phrase, weather whack-a-mole. Here in Chicago, it's been almost a weather roller coaster. It's been really hot. We got a little bit of relief yesterday, but today those temperatures are going to soar, hitting the 90s again. When you add in the humidity that we're already feeling here, that stickiness in the air, you're going to be flirting with a feels-like temperature of 100 degrees here in Chicago. And look, this is more mild conditions than other parts of the country, especially when you look at the South, where we have more than 70 million people waking up to a heat advisory this morning. You're going to be seeing triple-digit temperatures in some places. That's after what you saw yesterday when you mentioned more than a dozen places from Connecticut all the way down to South Carolina meeting or exceeding some of those records. Those heat records that were set yesterday, by the way, going back more than 100 years. So it will be another hot day here in Chicago. It will be another hot day for people all across the country, Joe.
Yeah, it even turned deadly in St. Louis. I mean, how are people handling these high temperatures?
Yeah, you know, that's one of the threats that we always have with these high temperatures, with this heat. In St. Louis, a woman was in her home without air conditioning, without water, police say, for more than 3 days. She unfortunately lost her life. What you're seeing across different cities, the opening of those cooling centers, folks saying that, you know, check on your neighbor, make sure that they have water, transport them to some of those cooling centers if needed. You're also seeing some energy companies in Kansas City, Missouri, handing out fans for people who don't have that AC. Just getting the air circulating helps in many instances. And then you see some of that video on the screen right now. Those are the road repairs that are taking place in all of these different cities. I know in Wisconsin you had more than 50 roads since this heat wave buckling and creating, closing down roads and creating those conditions. So that's something you're seeing, another consequence to the extreme heat that we're seeing in different parts of the country, Joe.
Impacts us in so many ways. All right, Shaq, stay cool. Thanks so much for your report. Appreciate it. These sizzling summer temps are still hanging around this morning. Relief, though. Here's the good news on the way for New England and the upper Midwest. So let's go to meteorologist Michelle Grossman for the forecast. Michelle, good morning.
Good morning, Joe. Yeah, New England looking really good today in the 70s, upper Midwest into the 60s. So nice and comfortable. We have a front that's sort of dividing two parts of the eastern half of the nation. I'll show you that in just a minute. But Shaq mentioned this, 70 million under heat alerts. Most of them are heat advisories. That's where we see the orange. We do have a bit in an extreme heat warning. That includes Charleston, West Virginia. And that is in that bright pink color there. And we're going to see temperatures soaring once again into the 90s. Better, though, in most spots than where we have been the past few days. There's that front that I was telling you about, kind of dividing the New England, upper Midwest, the upper Great Lakes from portions south of this front. So 70 today in Boston, 62 in Alpena. We're looking at Minneapolis, 68 degrees, really nice and comfortable in a late June day. But south of this front, we're going to see those temperatures dangerously warm once again into the 90s, 96 today in Charlotte, 93 in Cincinnati, 92 in Birmingham. And notice what happens tomorrow. It's called a backdoor cold front, so it sinks a little bit further to the south. So now we're bringing relief into places like New York City, Philadelphia tomorrow, just 73, 67 in Boston. And we're going to keep it warm south of that front once again into the 90s, 93 in Charleston, West Virginia, keeping that heat really in portions of the Ohio Valley tomorrow and then south. 95 in Raleigh, 92 in Knoxville. And we're going to see very seasonable temperatures as we go throughout the weekend in New York City. We're looking at 80s Saturday, Sunday, Monday, low 80s on Monday. Temperatures into the 90s in Nashville, 93 on Saturday. Same story on Sunday, 94 on Monday. So that's the big story once again. We are also looking at another big story. We have that front that I showed you, and we are looking at showers and storms along this front. So we have a flood risk, an ongoing flash flood risk throughout portions of the Midwest, and showers and storms dotting the southeast too. So this warmth, Joe, is going to kind of spark these showers and storms, so we could see heavy downpours with them. Back to you.
We know you'll keep an eye on it, Michelle. Thank you so much.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.